Some storms do not arrive to destroy us. Sometimes, they come carrying the truth we were never meant to ignore. The storm rolled across northern Montana like something ancient and restless, pressing low against the earth as if the sky itself had grown too heavy to carry its grief. Rain hammered the empty back roads in cold silver sheets, turning gravel into mud and pine branches into trembling shadows beneath the occasional flash of lightning. 30 miles outside the nearest town, Ethan Cross kept both hands steady on the wheel of his aging Ford pickup, the heater rattling weakly against the cold while windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. At 40 years old, Ethan carried the quiet shape of a man who had learned long ago that survival was less about strength and more about endurance. His broad shoulders still carried the posture of a Marine staff sergeant, though time and silence had softened the sharp edges into something heavier, something lonelier. A faded olive canvas jacket rested over a gray thermal shirt, damp at the collar from the rain he had walked through earlier that evening. Faint streaks of silver touched his dark brown hair near the temples, and the stormlight caught briefly against the stubble lining his jaw whenever lightning cracked open the night. He had not planned to be driving these roads. Truthfully, Ethan had stopped making plans after leaving the Corps. Too many things had disappeared too quickly overseas for him to trust permanence anymore. Since then, life had become simpler. Temporary construction jobs, quiet cabins, long roads with no expectation waiting at the end. Yet tonight, something restless had followed him since sunset. The kind of feeling Marines learn not to ignore. The kind that settled low beneath the ribs and whispered that something was wrong long before reason arrived. The truck rolled through a narrow stretch of forest where towering pines leaned over the road like silent witnesses. Thunder growled overhead, deep and distant, shaking loose streams of rain from the branches. Ethan adjusted the radio, but static swallowed every station. For a while, there was only the sound of tires crunching wet gravel and wind pushing hard against steel. Then he heard it. At first, he thought it was part of the storm. A faint metallic sound buried beneath thunder. Sharp, rhythmic, like steel scraping against stone. Ethan slowed the truck instinctively. The sound came again. Clink, drag, clink. He frowned, glancing toward the tree line. The beam of his headlights swept briefly across an old service road nearly hidden beneath overgrown brush. Something about it felt abandoned, forgotten. But there it was again, metal against metal. And then, quieter this time, almost swallowed by the wind, came something else. A bark. Short, hoarse, strained. Ethan's hands tightened slightly around the wheel. He pulled onto the shoulder without fully thinking about it. Old instincts moved faster than logic ever could. The rain hit harder the moment he stepped outside. Cold water soaked through denim almost immediately as wind pushed against him hard enough to steal breath. Somewhere deeper in the trees, lightning flashed, revealing the silhouette of what looked like an abandoned property. A rusted gate leaned sideways beneath overgrown weeds, and beyond it stood the shadow of an old equipment shed barely standing against the storm. The metallic sound echoed again. Clink, drag. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from beneath his seat and moved carefully through ankle-deep mud. Easy, he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he meant himself or whatever waited ahead. The closer he got, the stranger the feeling became. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The kind soldiers sometimes felt before stepping into dangerous places they somehow already understood. Another flash of lightning lit the clearing. And there, tied to a steel post near the broken shed, stood a German shepherd. The dog was soaked through, his silver gray and cream coat darkened by rain, ears pinned low against the thunder, while a thick chain wrapped around his collar rattled violently against rusted metal. Yet what stopped Ethan cold was not the storm, or even the sight of the animal standing alone in the freezing rain. It was the way the dog looked at him. No barking, no panic, no aggression. Just sharp amber eyes fixed on him with something that felt painfully close to recognition, like he had been waiting for someone to finally stop. Ethan stopped several feet away, rain dripping from the edge of his jacket, while thunder rolled softly above the treetops like distant artillery remembered by the sky. The German shepherd did not retreat, did not bark. He simply stood there beside the steel post, chest rising slowly, water running from his thick coat in silver streams beneath the occasional flash of lightning. Something about the stillness unsettled Ethan more than fear ever could. Most dogs trapped alone in weather like this would panic, growl, tremble. This one only watched him with quiet patience, as if he had already decided whether Ethan could be trusted. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, lowering the flashlight beam toward the muddy ground instead of directly into the dog's eyes. His voice carried the same calm steadiness he had once used overseas while helping frightened civilians after storms and collapsed roads. "You are all right. I am not here to hurt you." The dog's ears twayed slightly, not relaxed exactly, but listening. Ethan stepped closer, boots sinking into cold mud. Up close, he could see the chain more clearly now. Thick steel, heavy duty, newer than the abandoned property surrounding it. Whoever left the dog here had not forgotten him, which somehow felt worse. The collar sat too tight against thick fur, rubbing the skin raw in places where rainwater collected. Ethan crouched slowly, careful not to rush the moment. The dog lowered his head just enough for Ethan to notice something strange stitched into the weatherproof collar. Not a name tag, not county registration. A faded black patch secured beneath hardened mud. Ethan brushed it gently with gloved fingers until silver lettering emerged through the grime. K9 unit. Beneath it, almost impossible to read in the stormlight, sat a code number half scratched away. The Marine in him stiffened instinctively. "Well," he muttered quietly, "you have seen things too, huh?" For a moment, the dog said nothing. Then slowly, carefully, he stepped forward. Ethan felt warm breath against his hand. Trust given in inches. The kind that mattered. Somewhere behind the shed, wind rattled loose metal roofing with a hollow groan that echoed through the trees. The dog's entire posture changed instantly. Ears forward, body rigid, amber eyes fixed hard toward the darkness beyond the property line. Not fear. Alertness. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing moved except rain sliding between the pines. Still, the silence felt strangely crowded, as though something had recently left or perhaps never fully gone. "Easy," Ethan whispered again, though this time he felt himself listening harder too. He reached for the chain lock. Rust stained the metal, but the padlock itself looked newer than everything else around it. Someone had fastened it recently. Ethan tugged once. Solid. He sighed quietly and walked back toward the truck for the bolt cutters he kept beneath the passenger seat. Old habit from construction jobs and too many broken gates in mountain country. By the time he returned, rain had softened into something colder, steadier. The dog had not moved. He still faced the tree line with unwavering focus, watching something Ethan could not yet see. "You are stubborn," Ethan said faintly, kneeling beside him. "Guess that makes two of us." One firm squeeze, and the chain snapped loose with a sharp metallic crack swallowed quickly by thunder. Ethan expected relief. Movement. Gratitude, maybe. Instead, the German Shepherd remained exactly where he stood. Water dripped from his muzzle as he turned briefly toward Ethan before immediately looking back at the old equipment shed behind them. Waiting. Watching. As though leaving was the last thing on his mind. Then, for the first time since Ethan arrived, the dog let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not a growl. Not fear. Something quieter. More certain. A warning meant for someone willing to listen. The rain eased into a cold mist that drifted low across the clearing, wrapping the broken shed and rusted fencing in pale silver shadows that seemed to breathe each time the wind moved through the pines. Ethan remained crouched beside the German Shepherd, one gloved hand resting loosely near the cut chain, while thunder rolled farther into the distance, like something finally losing interest in the earth below. The dog had not taken a single step away from the steel post. His body remained fixed toward the shed, muscles tight beneath soaked fur, ears angled forward with complete concentration. Whatever held his attention lived somewhere beyond instinct. Ethan had spent enough years around trained dogs during deployments to know the difference. This was not nervousness. This was purpose. "You are not done here," Ethan said quietly, following the dog's gaze. "That it?" The shepherd flicked one ear toward him, but did not move. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the sagging roof nearby. Somewhere deeper in the woods, wind carried the faint creak of shifting branches. Otherwise, the property sat buried beneath a silence so complete it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that arrived after something important had already happened. Ethan stood slowly, joints stiff from cold. "All right," he muttered. "We look around." Then we leave. The words sounded practical enough, but part of him already knew he was lying to himself. Marines learned quickly that trouble rarely announced itself politely. It lingered in details, in bad feelings, in places that looked too empty. The flashlight beam swept across the clearing as Ethan approached the shed. Rust streaked down warped aluminum siding, and one window sat shattered near the corner, dark as an open mouth against the stormlight. Tall weeds pushed through broken concrete near the entrance, bending beneath collected rainwater. No tire tracks remained visible in the mud, but something about the ground felt recently disturbed. Fresh enough to matter. Behind him, the German shepherd moved at last. Quietly, purposefully. He stayed close to Ethan's side, but kept glancing toward the far edge of the property where pine trees gathered thick enough to swallow moonlight. The chain still dragged softly behind him, clinking against wet stone every few steps. Ethan noticed the dog limping slightly now, favoring one rear leg though trying hard not to show weakness. Old soldier habit, he thought. Hide the pain. Keep moving anyway. The shed door hung partially open. Wind pushed it back and forth with a low wooden groan. Ethan paused near the entrance, letting his flashlight cut through darkness first. Dust floated through the beam like drifting smoke. Shelving units leaned crooked against the walls, stacked with rusted cans, broken tools, and empty storage bins coated in years of neglect. Yet something felt wrong. Too clean in certain places. One corner near the back wall showed less dust than the rest, as though something large had recently been moved. Before Ethan could step closer, the shepherd froze again. His ears rose sharply. A low sound rolled through his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Then suddenly, he turned away from the shed entirely and stared hard toward the forest beyond the property. Ethan followed instinctively. At first, he saw nothing but darkness layered between rain-soaked trees. Then lightning flickered far overhead, illuminating the narrow dirt road leading into the woods. Deep tire tracks stretched through the mud, fresh enough to glisten. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. The dog took one slow step backward toward Ethan and sat beside him without looking away from the road, posture rigid, eyes alert. Protective now. Waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly through the cold. You think somebody is coming back, he said softly. The dog finally turned his head toward him for the briefest moment. And somehow, impossibly, it felt less like a guess and more like an answer. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, listening to the hush that settled after the storm began losing its temper. Rain still drifted softly through the pines, but the sharp violence of earlier had faded into something quieter, colder, more uncertain. Beside him, the German shepherd remained seated, body rigid, amber eyes fixed on the dark road disappearing into the forest as though memory itself lived somewhere between those trees. Ethan had learned long ago not to ignore instincts that arrived without explanation. Fear shouted. Experience whispered. And right now, every quiet part of him said the same thing. Leave. Yet something stronger held him there. Maybe it was the look in the dog's eyes. Maybe it was the chain still hanging loose around his neck like proof that somebody had gone to effort to keep him exactly where he was. Or maybe Ethan simply understood what abandonment looked like when life had already taken enough from someone. He exhaled slowly and crouched beside the shepherd again. We are not sticking around to find out who owns this place, he said softly, voice steady against the wind. But first, we get you warm. For the first time, the dog seemed to hesitate. His ears flicked toward Ethan, then back to the road, uncertainty passing briefly across his expression in a way that felt almost painfully human. Then, after a moment, he rose slowly to his feet. The limp looked worse now that adrenaline had faded. Careful steps. Controlled pain. Ethan recognized that too. Back at the truck, warm air struggled weakly from the vents as Ethan tossed an old wool blanket across the passenger seat. The shepherd paused beside the open door, watching the road behind them one final time before climbing inside without resistance. No hesitation. No confusion. Just discipline. Ethan shut the door gently and climbed into the driver's seat, rain tapping softly against the windshield now like fingers against old glass. Guess you have done this before, he muttered quietly. The dog settled into the seat but remained alert, ears twitching at every distant sound carried through the storm. Ethan pulled back onto the narrow road, tires crunching wet gravel as the abandoned property slowly disappeared behind them. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them made a sound. Northern Montana stretched dark and endless beyond the windshield, pine-covered ridges rising like sleeping giants beneath low clouds. The nearest town sat another 40 miles east, but Ethan knew a place closer. A cabin he rented seasonally near Cold Creek Ridge. Small, quiet, mostly forgotten, which suited him fine. Halfway there, the truck's old radio crackled unexpectedly through static. Ethan adjusted the dial without much thought. Mostly weather reports. Broken signals. Fragments of country music fading in and out like memories that forgot where they belonged. Then a local emergency station briefly cut through the noise. Authorities are asking residents to report suspicious activity near restricted forest properties. Static swallowed the rest. Beside him, the shepherd reacted instantly. His head lifted, ears forward, breathing sharpened. Ethan glanced sideways. "Easy," he said quietly, though his own chest tightened a little too. The dog stared hard at the radio speaker now, posture completely changed. Alert, focused, waiting. Ethan turned the volume lower. The shepherd relaxed only slightly, though his eyes remained fixed ahead. Strange. Stranger still, when Ethan reached toward the collar to dry it with an old towel resting beside the seat, his fingers brushed against something hidden beneath damp fur. Not the heavy chain. Something smaller. Hard plastic. Carefully, he shifted the collar just enough to see beneath it. A jagged scar crossed the skin near the dog's neck, where fur no longer grew fully back. Just below it sat the edge of something embedded beneath the collar strap. A damaged tracking device. Or what remained of one. Ethan frowned, rubbing rainwater from his knuckles. "Who exactly were you running from?" he murmured softly. Outside, thunder faded deeper into the mountains. But somewhere far behind them, beyond dark roads and silent trees, a pair of distant headlights appeared briefly through the rain before disappearing again into the night. Cold Creek Ridge appeared just before midnight, tucked beneath a line of towering pines where fog settled low enough to soften the edges of everything it touched. Ethan's cabin stood alone at the edge of a narrow clearing, weathered cedar walls darkened by years of mountain winters and quiet seasons no one bothered counting anymore. A single porch light glowed warm against the darkness, casting soft amber across damp wood and wind-chimed silence. Ethan parked beneath the old spruce tree beside the porch and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither he nor the German shepherd moved. The truck settled into stillness around them, ticking softly as the engine cooled. Outside, rain lingered in faint silver drifts, brushing through branches with the sound of distant whispers. Ethan rubbed tired fingers against his jaw and glanced sideways. "Well," he said quietly, "this place is not much, but it is dry." The shepherd remained alert in the passenger seat, watching the woods beyond the porch instead of Ethan. Even now, after miles of driving, something restless still lived behind those amber eyes. Not panic, vigilance. Like a soldier who knew sleeping too deeply came with consequences. Ethan stepped out first, boots crunching damp gravel, before circling around to open the passenger door. The dog hesitated only briefly before climbing down, favoring the injured leg again, though doing his best to hide it. Up close beneath porch light, Ethan finally saw the full toll the storm had taken. Mud caked thick between the shepherd's paws. Fur hung heavy with rainwater, and beneath the silver-gray coat, ribs pressed slightly too visible beneath muscle. Not starving, but close enough to hardship to matter. "Come on," Ethan said softly. "Let us get you out of the cold." Inside, warmth arrived slowly. Ethan fed dry cedar into the cast iron stove near the stone wall, and before long, the cabin filled with the comforting scent of smoke and old wood warmed by fire. The place carried little decoration. A worn leather chair beside the stove. Fishing maps curled slightly at the corners. Old photographs stored face down on shelves Ethan rarely touched anymore. Simpler that way. Easier. The shepherd paused just inside the doorway, scanning every corner with disciplined precision before finally stepping farther inside. Ethan noticed immediately how deliberate the dog moved. Not exploring. Clearing. Watching windows. Doorways. Blind spots. K-9 training, no doubt about it. "You really were somebody's partner once," Ethan murmured quietly. He found an old towel from the laundry shelf, and crouched near the fire. "Come here." To Ethan's surprise, the dog obeyed almost immediately. Slow steps. Careful trust. He lowered himself near the stove, muscles relaxing for what felt like the first time all night as warmth reached soaked fur. Ethan dried him gently, pausing when his hand brushed again against the damaged collar. This time, with better light, he studied it more closely. The tracking device sat partially shattered near the buckle, scratched deeply as if someone had tried deliberately to disable it. Stranger still, beneath the worn K9 patch, another detail emerged through dried mud. Tiny stitched letters. "Ranger." Ethan read the name quietly beneath his breath. "Ranger." The dog's ears twitched instantly. His head lifted. Ethan blinked once, surprised. "That your name?" Ranger watched him carefully for a moment, then settled again beside the stove with what almost looked like relief. Outside, wind rattled softly against cabin windows while darkness deepened across the ridge. Ethan filled a bowl with water and heated leftover beef stew on the stove, setting part of it carefully beside the fire once cooled. Ranger ate politely. Controlled. Slow. Military discipline again. Yet, twice during the meal, the dog stopped suddenly and stared toward the front window. Listening. Waiting. Ethan followed his gaze but saw only trees swaying gently beneath moonlit mist. Still, the feeling returned. That quiet pressure low in his chest. Like something unfinished had followed them home. Near 1 a.m, as firelight flickered softly against cedar walls, Ethan reached for the old battery radio near the kitchen counter. Mostly habit. Weather updates before bed. But the moment static gave way to a local station, Ranger stood abruptly, posture tightening. His ears shot forward. Then came the words through scattered interference. State and federal authorities continue investigating unusual activity tied to several abandoned forest properties. Ranger let out one low sound deep in his throat and walked slowly toward the door, eyes fixed on the darkness outside, as if he already knew the story was not over. The mountains grew quieter after midnight, the kind of silence that belonged only to remote places where wind carried stories no one stayed long enough to hear. Cold Creek Ridge rested beneath a sky slowly clearing of storm clouds, moonlight spreading silver across the trees while frost gathered faintly along the porch rails outside. Inside the cabin, warmth settled unevenly against cedar walls as firelight flickered low and steady. Ethan sat near the stove with an untouched mug of coffee cooling beside him, his eyes drifting occasionally toward Ranger, who remained near the front door instead of the comfortable blanket Ethan had placed near the fire. The dog had not relaxed fully. Even exhausted, even finally warm, something inside him remained awake. Watching, listening, waiting. Twice now, Ethan had caught Ranger shifting toward the front windows at sounds too distant for ordinary ears. Branches snapping somewhere downhill. Wind moving strangely through the trees. Once, just after 1:30 in the morning, Ranger rose so suddenly that the old rocking chair creaked beneath Ethan's startled movement. The shepherd stood motionless, ears sharp, eyes fixed hard on the darkness beyond the glass. Ethan listened too. Nothing. Just mountain silence. Yet somehow that silence felt crowded. Heavy. Like unseen things passing carefully through the night. "Nobody is coming," Ethan said quietly, though he realized almost immediately he was trying to convince himself as much as the dog. Ranger remained standing for another minute before finally settling near the door again, though he did not lie down this time. Sometime close to 2, Ethan reached for the old flashlight hanging beside the kitchen shelf and walked toward the mudroom where he had tossed Ranger's damaged chain earlier. Something about the collar still bothered him. Too much care had gone into removing identification. Too much effort into disabling tracking. Whoever had handled this dog had wanted him difficult to trace. Ethan laid the heavy collar across the wooden workbench beneath the dim overhead light and studied it carefully. Years in construction had taught him patience with damaged things. Sometimes the truth lived inside details people missed. Dirt flaked loose beneath his fingers as he cleaned carefully around the damaged tracking unit. The scratches looked deliberate now, deep enough to destroy signal, but not random. Controlled damage. Intentional. Beneath the buckle, something hard pressed strangely against the fabric lining. Ethan frowned and carefully turned the collar over. Hidden beneath a folded seam sat a tiny stitched pocket nearly impossible to notice unless someone looked closely. What were they hiding? He muttered quietly. Ranger lifted his head immediately from across the room. Watching, Ethan slid a pocket knife carefully beneath the thread and loosened the stitching just enough to reach inside. At first, he thought it was debris. A folded scrap wrapped tightly in waterproof plastic no larger than a matchbook. Strange. He unfolded it slowly. Inside sat a tiny storage card no bigger than his thumbnail. Beside it, folded impossibly small, rested a narrow strip of paper covered in faded handwriting. Ethan turned the paper toward the light. Most of the ink had blurred from moisture, but one line remained legible enough to stop him cold. If Ranger finds you, do not trust the property. Ethan read it again. Then again. Outside, wind pressed softly against the cabin walls like something listening. His pulse slowed in that familiar way old instincts often returned before trouble. Somewhere deep in memory, Ethan remembered a Marine captain once telling him something simple during deployment. When someone risks everything to leave a message, assume they were afraid no one else would survive long enough to explain it. Behind him, Ranger stood quietly now, watching Ethan with an expression too steady to ignore. Not anxious, not confused, almost expectant, like he already knew what Ethan had just found. Ethan glanced toward the dark windows where pine trees stood motionless beneath moonlight. Then back to the tiny storage card resting in his palm. You have been trying to tell me something all night, he said softly. Ranger lowered his head once. Slow, certain, as though somewhere beneath fear and exhaustion, trust had finally begun. Sleep never fully arrived after that. The mountains remained too quiet, and quiet places had a way of sharpening old instincts Ethan had spent years trying to bury beneath routine. Near 3 in the morning, the fire burned lower inside the cabin, settling into soft orange embers that painted slow-moving shadows across cedar walls. Ranger had finally moved away from the front door, but only barely. He rested near Ethan's chair now, though his ears still twitched toward sounds too distant to understand. The tiny storage card sat on the kitchen table beside the folded note, catching faint reflections from the stove light like something far too small to carry consequences. Ethan had turned it over in his fingers at least 10 times already. No label, no markings, deliberately plain. Whoever hid it inside Ranger's collar had not wanted it discovered by accident. The question was why, and perhaps more importantly, who had written the warning. If Ranger finds you, do not trust the property. The sentence repeated itself quietly inside Ethan's thoughts, refusing to leave. Not trust what property? The abandoned one from the storm? Or somewhere else entirely? Outside, frost had begun forming along the cabin windows, moonlight turning the glass pale and ghost-like against the darkness beyond. Ethan finally pushed himself up from the chair with a quiet sigh and crossed toward the old storage cabinet near the kitchen. Somewhere beneath camping supplies and fishing maps sat an outdated laptop he mostly used for weather reports during long winters. If the card held answers, waiting until morning no longer felt practical. Ranger rose immediately the moment Ethan moved. Not startled. Ready. Always ready. You can relax, Ethan said softly, though his own voice carried less certainty than he intended. I'm just checking something. The dog followed anyway. Close enough to matter. The laptop groaned awake slowly on the kitchen counter, old fan rattling faintly while weak blue light filled the room. Ethan found a card reader buried inside a drawer and slid the tiny storage card carefully into place. For a second, nothing happened. Then one folder appeared on screen. No name, just numbers. Encrypted maybe, or hidden intentionally. Ethan clicked once. A single video file sat inside, dated 3 weeks earlier. No title. No explanation. His chest tightened in that quiet way experience often returned before trouble. Ranger had gone still again beside him, eyes fixed on the screen. Ethan hesitated. Somewhere in the distance outside, wind pushed softly through the trees, carrying the lonely creak of branches rubbing together high above the ridge. Then suddenly Ranger stepped forward and pressed one paw firmly against Ethan's leg. Not nervous. Intentional. Ethan looked down. You know what this is? Ranger held his gaze longer than felt ordinary, then turned slowly toward the front window. His posture stiffened instantly. Ethan followed his attention. At first, he saw only darkness, pine trees swaying gently against silver moonlight. But then something shifted near the lower ridge road below the property. A glow. faint headlights weaving carefully through the trees before vanishing again behind brush. Too slow for travelers. Too late for tourists. Ethan felt something old settle quietly back into place inside his chest. The part of him the Marines had built. Calm. Measured. Listening. Ranger let out one low sound deep in his throat and stepped directly in front of the cabin door. Protective now. Certain. Ethan looked once toward the laptop screen still glowing softly on the counter. Then back toward the road below where darkness had swallowed the headlights again. Whoever had left Ranger chained in that storm might not be finished looking for him. And somehow, without fully realizing when it happened, Ethan understood something that made sleep impossible. He had not rescued Trouble from the mountain. Trouble had followed the dog home. The night stretched thin after that, fragile in the way mountain silence often became when something unseen moved beneath it. Ethan turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the stove glowing softly against the cabin walls while moonlight spilled pale silver through the windows. Ranger remained planted near the front door, body still, eyes fixed toward the darkness beyond the ridge road as though the world outside had begun speaking in frequencies only he understood. The faint headlights never returned, but neither of them relaxed. Somewhere between instinct and memory, Ethan recognized the feeling settling into the room. Anticipation. Not fear exactly. Waiting. He had felt it before overseas on long nights before supply convoys arrived or storms changed direction without warning. Trouble rarely announced itself loudly. Most of the time, it arrived quietly enough to be mistaken for coincidence. Ethan crossed back toward the kitchen counter and stared at the laptop screen glowing beside the untouched coffee mug. The single video file remained there. Silent. Waiting. Whatever lived inside, that file had likely been hidden for a reason. Yet opening it now felt strangely secondary compared to the unease pressing quietly against the cabin walls. Ranger turned suddenly. Not toward the road this time. Toward the back of the property. Ears forward. Body rigid. Then came the sound. Soft at first. Tires over gravel. Somewhere beyond the tree line behind the cabin. Slow enough to matter. Ethan froze instinctively. The old Marine part of him moved before thought arrived. He lowered the laptop screen halfway and stepped quietly toward the wall near the mudroom where an old flashlight rested beside hanging winter coats. Ranger remained completely silent, though tension rolled visibly through his shoulders now. Protective. Focused. Whoever approached was not a surprise to him. Outside, the sound faded briefly, swallowed by trees and wind. Then came another noise. A car door shutting somewhere below the ridge. Ethan glanced toward the front window, but saw only darkness layered between pines. No headlights now. Whoever it was had parked out of sight. Ranger shifted one careful step closer to Ethan and lowered his head slightly, waiting for instruction. Or maybe giving one. Ethan crouched beside him, hand resting briefly against thick damp fur still warm from the fire. "You know something I do not," he whispered quietly. Ranger's ears twitched once. Then came 3 soft knocks against the cabin door. Not aggressive. Not loud. Deliberate. Measured. The kind of knocking people used when they did not want neighbors overhearing. Ethan stood slowly. Every quiet instinct inside him sharpened all at once. Nobody came to Cold Creek Ridge at 3:30 in the morning unless something had gone wrong. Or unless they wanted something badly enough to ignore common sense. Ranger stepped directly in front of the door now, body angled protectively. No growling. No barking. Just complete stillness. Ethan reached for the porch light switch and flipped it on. Warm amber spilled outside, catching drifting fog and frost gathering along old wooden steps. A woman stood near the edge of the porch wearing a dark weatherproof jacket, shoulders dusted lightly with mist. Mid-30s, maybe late 30s. Sharp posture. Hands visible. Calm, but tired in the way people looked after too many sleepless nights. She did not glance at Ethan first. Her eyes moved immediately to Ranger, standing in the doorway. Whatever composure she carried shifted for the briefest second. Relief. Shock. Recognition. "Please," she said softly through the closed door, voice steady but strained around exhaustion. "Before you decide whether to trust me, I need you to know one thing." She paused, eyes never leaving the dog. That shepherd was never supposed to survive long enough to find someone. Ranger let out one low sound deep in his chest. Neither warning nor welcome. Recognition. Ethan's hand remained firmly on the doorframe as wind moved quietly through the pines around them. Somewhere behind the woman, Dawn still felt impossibly far away. For a long moment, nobody moved. Cold air drifted through the cracks around the cabin door, carrying the scent of wet pine and distant frost, while moonlight pooled softly across the porch boards between them. Ethan studied the woman carefully, years of habit refusing to loosen their grip. People arrived at isolated mountain cabins before dawn for one of two reasons: desperation or trouble, sometimes both. Ranger remained standing in front of the doorway, body still and watchful. Yet something subtle had changed in him. The rigid alertness from earlier softened just enough to matter. Not trust exactly, but recognition. The woman noticed it too. Her shoulders lowered slightly, as though she had been holding tension for far too long. "You know him," Ethan said quietly, keeping one hand on the doorframe. It was not really a question. The woman nodded once. "His name is Ranger," she said softly. "He was part of an active federal investigation." Her voice carried no dramatic edge, no rehearsed authority, just exhaustion. The kind worn by people who had spent too many nights trying to hold broken things together. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Federal?" She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the dark woods behind her before reaching slowly into her jacket pocket. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." She carefully held up identification, keeping her movements measured enough not to startle either man or dog. Ethan looked at the badge but did not immediately step aside. The mountains had taught him caution, or had taught him more. And why exactly would the Federal Bureau of Investigation be tracking a dog chained to a post in the middle of nowhere? Claire exhaled slowly, mist gathering around her breath in the cold. "Because somebody wanted him gone," she said quietly. "And because Ranger was never just a K9. The sentence settled strangely in the air. Ranger lowered his head slightly, but never looked away from Claire. Then, unexpectedly, he took one slow step forward. Ethan watched carefully, expecting tension. Instead, Ranger stopped near the doorway and quietly pressed his nose once against Claire's hand. Familiar, trusting. The woman blinked hard, emotion passing briefly across her face before disappearing behind professionalism again. "Good boy," she whispered softly, voice cracking just enough to betray how relieved she truly felt. Ethan stepped back at last. "Come inside," he said quietly. "You look half frozen." The cabin warmed again once the door closed behind her. Claire stood near the stove, removing damp gloves while Ranger remained unusually close, settling near her boots for the first time all night. Ethan noticed immediately. Whatever connection existed between them ran deeper than coincidence. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and handed it over without ceremony. Claire accepted with tired gratitude. "Thank you." Silence lingered for a few moments while firelight flickered against the walls. Then Ethan placed the folded note and tiny storage card carefully onto the kitchen table between them. Claire froze. Her expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Concern. "Where did you find those?" "Hidden inside Ranger's collar," Ethan said. "There is also a video file on the card." Claire closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion pressing harder into her features now. "Then we are already late," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Late for what?" Claire stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. Outside, wind brushed softly against the cabin windows like something listening from the dark. 3 weeks ago," she said at last, "a federal investigator disappeared while uncovering something tied to abandoned forest properties across Montana." She looked down at Ranger resting beside her boots. His last message said if anything happened to him, Ranger would know where the truth was hidden. Ethan felt the room grow quieter somehow. Slower. Heavy in ways hard to explain. "And the investigator?" he asked softly. Claire hesitated. "We stopped hearing from him." Ranger lifted his head then and stared directly toward the laptop sitting quietly on the counter. The one holding the unopened video file. Waiting. The fire settled lower as night stretched toward morning, quiet embers glowing against the cast iron stove while frost thickened softly along the edges of the cabin windows. Outside, Cold Creek Ridge stood wrapped in silver mist, pine branches bowing gently beneath the cold like silent witnesses to something the mountain itself had been waiting to remember. Inside, nobody spoke for several moments. The weight of unfinished questions lingered too heavily between them. Claire sat near the kitchen counter, both hands wrapped around the chipped coffee mug Ethan had given her, though the drink had long since cooled. Ranger remained close to her feet now, calmer than before, but still alert, amber eyes shifting occasionally toward the laptop sitting on the counter, as though time itself had narrowed around whatever waited inside that hidden file. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You said Ranger knows where the truth is hidden." Claire nodded slowly. "The investigator believed Ranger was more than backup," she said quietly. "He trusted the dog to remember what people might forget." Ethan glanced toward Ranger. Dogs do not exactly leave witness statements. To Ethan's surprise, Claire smiled faintly for the first time all night. Tired. Sad. Familiar somehow. "No," she said softly. "But trained K-9 units remember routes, smells, locations. Especially dogs like him." Her expression darkened slightly. Ranger worked with Special Agent Daniel Mercer. The name landed strangely in the room. Ethan frowned faintly. Something about it tugged at memory, though exhaustion kept the thought just out of reach. Claire continued carefully. "Daniel disappeared 3 weeks ago while tracking unusual activity tied to abandoned government properties across northern Montana. Old forestry stations, storage lots, former military land, places people stopped paying attention to." Wind brushed quietly against the cabin walls. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Daniel's name, but did not move. "His final transmission was incomplete," Claire continued. "But before communication stopped, he sent one instruction." She glanced toward the folded note resting beside the laptop. "If anything happens to me, trust Ranger." Ethan leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. "And now?" Claire hesitated. "Now the Bureau thinks Daniel walked away from the case." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You do not believe that?" "No," Claire said quietly. "Daniel was stubborn, loyal, too honest for his own good." She paused briefly. "He also would never abandon Ranger." The room fell quiet again. Firelight moved softly against cedar walls while distant wind whispered through the ridge outside, like something carrying forgotten prayers between trees. Finally, Ethan turned toward the laptop. "Then I guess we stop guessing." He lowered himself into the chair beside the counter and opened the screen fully again. The single video file still waited there. Silent. Untouched. Ranger stood slowly the moment Ethan reached for the trackpad. Not anxious. Certain. He moved beside Ethan's chair and rested quietly against his leg, eyes fixed firmly on the glowing screen. Claire straightened instinctively too. Whatever lived inside this recording mattered enough to survive storms, secrets, and fear. Ethan clicked play. Static flickered briefly across the screen before an image slowly emerged. A dimly lit room. Wooden walls. Dust floating through weak flashlight beams. The camera shifted shakily for a moment before settling. A man appeared. Mid-40s. Tired eyes. Windbreaker jacket marked with federal insignia. Behind him stood Ranger, younger somehow, calmer, sitting watch near an old metal door hidden inside what looked like a forgotten underground structure. The man glanced briefly toward the camera and exhaled hard before speaking. "If somebody is watching this," he said quietly, voice worn by exhaustion, "then something went wrong." Ranger lifted his head sharply beside Ethan, ears forward now. Recognition. On the screen, Daniel looked toward the dog standing behind him and gave the faintest tired smile. "Buddy," he said softly to Ranger. "If you found somebody worth trusting," he paused. "Look directly into the camera. Then whatever happens next, do not let them go back to the property alone." The video crackled once, then suddenly cut to black. The cabin felt smaller after the screen went dark. Firelight still moved softly across the walls, the stove crackling low in the corner, but something had shifted inside the room. Silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt occupied, heavy with unfinished things. Ethan remained seated in front of the laptop, one hand resting loosely against the edge of the table, while the frozen black screen reflected faint traces of amber firelight back toward him. Beside him, Ranger had not moved. The dog remained standing with complete focus, ears forward, breathing slow but sharp in a way Ethan recognized from years spent around men, carrying too much responsibility for too long. Recognition lingered in the shepherd's eyes. Not confusion, not fear. Memory. Claire exhaled quietly and leaned back against the counter, rubbing tired fingers against her forehead. "That was Daniel," she said softly, voice thinner now than before. "And if he left that message," she stopped herself, staring toward the dark laptop screen as though refusing to finish the thought aloud might somehow change reality. Ethan glanced toward her. He thought somebody was watching him. Claire nodded once. Daniel knew how to disappear when he needed to. If he believed he was being followed, she swallowed slowly. Then things were already bad. Outside, the wind moved gently through the ridge again, brushing branches softly against the cabin roof like distant footsteps too polite to interrupt. Ethan reached toward the laptop and rewound the video slowly. Something bothered him. Not Daniel's words. Something in the room behind him. The hidden structure. The metal door. He played the clip again, this time slower. Ranger shifted closer immediately, eyes fixed hard on the screen. Daniel stood beneath weak overhead lighting, dust floating through stale air while old wood framing lined the walls around him. Behind him, partially obscured by shadow, sat something mounted near the metal door. Ethan leaned closer. "Pause it," he muttered quietly to himself. Claire stepped beside him. "What is it?" Ethan pointed toward the corner of the frame. "That." At first, it looked meaningless. Just faded paint worn by age. But once paused, the image sharpened enough to reveal a symbol half hidden beneath dust. A number stenciled onto old concrete. Lot 47. The room grew still again. Ethan and Claire looked at one another at exactly the same moment. The abandoned property from the storm. The same rusted sign above the broken shed. Lot 47. Ranger stood abruptly now, tail low, posture tightening with unmistakable urgency. He walked directly to the front door and stopped, staring at it. Waiting. Ethan rose slowly from the chair. He wants to go back. Claire looked toward Ranger, concern deepening across her face. Daniel told us not to return alone. Ethan crossed his arms loosely, eyes drifting toward the frost-covered windows where dawn still hid behind the mountains. Then maybe he was not warning us to stay away, Ethan said quietly. Maybe he was warning us not to underestimate what is there. Ranger gave one sharp breath through his nose and glanced back toward them, impatient now. Focused. Claire hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else," she said softly. Daniel was not investigating ordinary trespassing. Ethan turned. Claire lowered her voice, though there was no one else to hear. He believed abandoned federal properties were being used to hide records connected to missing veterans and land transfers that never should have happened. Ethan frowned. "What kind of records?" Claire looked down at Ranger briefly before answering. "The kind that could ruin careers. The kind powerful people do not want uncovered." Outside, the first pale hints of dawn began touching the edge of the mountains, soft blue light slipping carefully through the trees. Ranger moved closer to the door again and rested one paw quietly against the wood. Waiting. Ethan stared toward him for a long moment before finally reaching for his jacket hanging near the mudroom. Somewhere deep inside, the old Marine instinct had already decided long before logic arrived. Whatever Daniel had tried to protect still waited at Lot 47. And somehow, Ranger had spent 3 weeks carrying the memory of where it was hidden. Morning arrived slowly across Cold Creek Ridge, pale light spreading through the mountains like something careful not to wake old ghosts too quickly. Frost shimmered silver along pine branches, and the sky above the eastern ridge carried the soft gray-blue color that only existed for a few quiet moments before sunrise fully claimed the day. Inside the cabin, movement replaced exhaustion. Ethan brewed fresh coffee while Claire stood near the counter reviewing notes pulled quietly from her phone, though poor mountain reception left most of the screen frozen in unfinished loading circles. Ranger had transformed entirely since dawn touched the windows. The uncertainty from the night before had disappeared. Now he moved with focus, purpose. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the front door as if keeping time to something invisible only he understood. Ethan noticed it immediately. "He knows where he wants to go," he said quietly, pulling on his canvas jacket. Claire nodded slowly. "That is what worries me." She lowered her phone. If Daniel hid something at Lot 47, he probably assumed nobody except Ranger would ever find it. Ranger stood suddenly near the doorway and gave one short breath through his nose, impatient now. Ethan crouched briefly beside him, checking the injured leg. The swelling had gone down slightly after warmth and rest, though the limp remained. "You sure you are up for this?" he asked softly. Ranger held his gaze for a second before standing taller, tail low but steady. Determined. Ethan almost smiled. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know the type." The drive back toward the abandoned property took nearly 40 minutes through winding mountain roads lined with pine forests still dripping from the storm. Morning fog hovered low between valleys, wrapping the landscape in quiet silver while sunlight struggled through heavy clouds above. Claire sat in the passenger seat this time, reviewing everything they knew in fragments. Missing investigator, hidden file, damaged tracker, federal properties tied to questionable transfers. Yet somehow none of it fit together cleanly. Daniel mentioned abandoned sites connected to old military land, she said quietly. Storage depots, research parcels, forestry stations nobody monitored anymore. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. And somehow all roads point back to a forgotten shed in the woods. Daniel believed something larger was being hidden through those locations, Claire replied. Financial records, ownership transfers, missing evidence. She hesitated before adding softly, veterans disappearing from assistance programs, properties changing hands without surviving family ever notified. Ethan said nothing for several moments. Outside, mountains passed quietly beyond the windshield. He had known men after deployment who vanished into systems too tired to remember their names. Veterans who stopped answering calls. Men who slowly became invisible. The thought settled heavier than he expected. Beside them, Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Ears forward. Focused. The old service road approached through the trees ahead. No hesitation now. The shepherd shifted closer to the front seats, body tense but not afraid. Ready. Ethan slowed the truck near the rusted entrance to Lot 47. Morning had changed the property somehow. Without stormlight and darkness, it looked less haunted but somehow sadder. Forgotten fencing leaned crooked beneath weeds. The broken shed sagged farther than Ethan remembered, roof bent low against years of neglect. Yet something felt wrong immediately. Fresh tire marks cut sharply through the mud leading toward the backside of the property. New. Very new. Claire noticed them too. Somebody has been here, she said quietly. Ranger was already staring toward the tree line beyond the shed, body perfectly still. Then, without warning, he climbed from the truck and moved quickly across the clearing despite the injured leg, nose low to the ground, following something only memory seemed capable of seeing. Ethan and Claire exchanged one quiet look before following. Beyond the shed, hidden behind overgrown brush and rusted fencing, Ranger stopped near what looked like an ordinary patch of collapsed earth. Leaves. Mud. Forgotten stone. He scratched once. Then twice. Claire frowned. What is he? Ethan crouched slowly and brushed away wet leaves with gloved hands. Beneath them sat metal. Rusted. Circular. Half buried beneath years of neglect. A hidden hatch. The hatch resisted at first, buried beneath years of mud and forgotten weather. But time had weakened even steel. Ethan gripped the rusted handle with both hands while Claire helped clear loose dirt from the edges. Ranger stood close beside them, completely still now, watching with unwavering focus, as if every step had already happened somewhere inside his memory. One final pull, and the hatch gave way with a deep metallic groan, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled faintly of damp concrete and old paper. Beneath them stretched a narrow stairwell, descending into darkness. Ethan clicked on his flashlight. Weak beams cut through dust floating lazily in the underground stillness. Daniel was here. Claire whispered quietly, almost to herself. Ranger moved first. Slow. Careful. The shepherd descended the steps without hesitation despite the slight limp, pausing halfway down to glance back, as if making certain they followed. Ethan exchanged one quiet look with Claire before stepping down behind him. The underground room opened wider than expected. Concrete walls. Old wiring. Forgotten shelves lined with storage boxes covered in dust thick enough to measure years. At the far end stood the same metal door from Daniel's video, slightly open now, waiting beneath dim morning light slipping through a cracked vent overhead. Ranger crossed directly toward a weathered desk sitting near the wall. He stopped there and lowered himself quietly beside it, nose resting near a faded backpack. Ethan crouched slowly, the initials stitched into the fabric red D. M. Daniel Mercer. Claire covered her mouth briefly, emotion breaking through the professionalism she had carried all night. He made it here, she whispered. Ethan opened the bag carefully. Inside rested neatly organized folders, flash drives, notebooks, and photographs tied together with handwritten labels. Records. Maps. Names. Quiet evidence gathered patiently over months. Claire moved closer, scanning page after page. Her expression changed slowly from uncertainty to disbelief. These are land transfer records, she said softly. Veteran housing parcels. Government support properties. She turned another page. Someone was moving ownership through shell companies after beneficiaries disappeared from the system. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Claire looked up slowly. Meaning people trusted to protect struggling veterans were taking advantage of abandoned claims and forgotten land. Ranger lifted his head then and nudged one final folder resting beneath the desk. Ethan picked it up carefully. Inside sat one handwritten letter addressed simply, "Whoever Ranger finds." The room fell quiet again. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly. Daniel's handwriting looked rushed but steady. "If you are reading this, Ranger did what I prayed he would do. First, trust the dog. He always knows who still has kindness left. Second, if I did not make it back, know this was never only about corruption. This was about forgotten people. Veterans nobody checked on. Men and women who slipped quietly through the cracks after serving everyone else first. If truth survives, make sure someone remembers them." Ethan read the final sentence twice before lowering the paper. Outside, somewhere far above them, morning wind moved gently through the trees. Ranger rested quietly at Ethan's side now, finally calm for the first time since the storm. Like something heavy had